From New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, this is Democracy Now!
While we are winning the ideological battle, and while we are winning the support of so many young people and working people throughout the country, I have concluded that this battle for the Democratic nomination will not be successful. And so today, I am announcing the suspension of my campaign.
Bernie Sanders suspends his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, making former Vice President Joe Biden the presumptive nominee to face Donald Trump in November. Sanders says he'll stay on the ballot in remaining primary races and continue to assemble delegates. We'll play highlights of Sanders' speech and talk to journalist and activist Naomi Klein about Sanders' historic presidential campaign and about coronavirus capitalism, President Trump's response to the pandemic.
This administration is uniquely ill-equipped to deal with this crisis because they are not treating it as a health crisis. They're treating it as a PR crisis.
Then we look at the devastating and disproportionate toll the coronavirus is taking on African Americans.
We are talking about it more now as we're beginning to, as a community, the African American community, people are talking about it more now because they're everyone seems to know someone who this has touched already, and seems to know someone whose life has been lost because of the virus.
We'll speak with family physician, epidemiologist Dr. Kamara Phyllis-Jones, past president of the American Public Health Association, who says coronavirus disease discriminates. Our health care doesn't have to. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, New York City. The coronavirus pandemic could push an additional 600 million people into poverty unless urgent action is taken to bail out poor countries. That's the finding of the British charity Oxfam, which is calling on world leaders to fund a $2.5 trillion rescue package to prevent global economic collapse. The proposal would cancel $1 trillion of poor countries' debts to free up cash for food and medicine. Oxfam warns that without massive intervention, half of all jobs in Africa could be lost to the pandemic. Worldwide, the coronavirus continues to spread exponentially, with over 1.5 million documented cases, nearly 90,000 deaths, though the true rate of infection is certain to be far higher due to a critical lack of testing. In Europe, there are signs social distancing measures are flattening the curve of new infections, with Spain, Italy, and France all recording fewer deaths over the past 24 hours. Here in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo said Wednesday the city has not yet reached its peak rate of deaths from COVID-19.
The bad news is actually terrible. Highest single-day death toll yet, 779 people. When you look at the numbers on the death toll, it has been going steadily up, and it reached a new height yesterday.
Governor Cuomo acknowledged the true death toll is certain to be higher because hundreds of people who've died of COVID-19 in their homes have not been counted. This comes as the New York Times reports Governor Cuomo and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio failed to trace the contacts of the first people known to be infected with coronavirus in early March, allowing the virus to spread undetected. The Times reports a failed federal response combined with unheeded warnings, delayed decisions, and political infighting at the state and local level to accelerate the spread of the virus across New York. The Trump administration said Wednesday it will pay General Motors nearly $500 million to manufacture 30,000 ventilators amidst a critical shortage of the life-saving devices. The White House says GM will deliver about 6,000 ventilators by the end of May, with the rest delivered through the summer to the end of August. Many models for COVID-19 in the United States predict the need for ventilators will peak this month before tapering off through the month of May. In Kansas, Republican lawmakers have reversed an order limiting the size of church services, raising fears of community spread at congregations celebrating Easter services. In Chicago, the Cook County Jail has emerged as the largest known source of coronavirus infections in the United States, with at least 353 COVID-19 cases linked to the jail. In Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti on Wednesday ordered all customers and essential workers to wear facial coverings in public.
Employers are required to provide these face protections or to reimburse employees for their costs. This applies to workers in grocery stores, drugstores, restaurants, hotels, taxis and rideshare vehicles, and construction sites.
In California, hundreds of workers at 30 fast food restaurants are on strike today to demand personal protective equipment and paid sick leave. This is Irving Gaza, a McDonald's worker in San Jose, joining a strike earlier this week.
I'm the one who's the most at risk. I am at the guy who's in the drive-thru. I'm very close contact with people. McDonald's doesn't want to pay me hazard pay or any of us hazard pay. We get no masks or anything like that, nothing.
Meanwhile, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union is calling on the Trump administration to issue mandatory safety policies to protect grocery store workers. The union wants to ensure all shoppers to wear masks with limits on the number of people allowed into a store at any given time, enforce social distancing, disinfecting and sanitizing procedures, and personal protective equipment for all workers. At the White House Wednesday, President Trump continued to promote hydroxychloroquine as a COVID-19 curative, even though no clinical trials have shown the drug to be effective at treating the virus. A medical journal which published a single French study suggesting a therapeutic use for the drug in treating coronavirus has since said the study does not meet expected medical standards and retracted it. Cardiologists are warning hydroxychloroquine has serious side effects and can cause sudden cardiac arrest in some patients. Meanwhile, President Trump promoted another chemical to his list of untested treatments.
Zinc, they say, zinc. You should add zinc. Now, it's all has to be recommended by doctors, physicians, but they say zinc.
There is no medical evidence showing zinc to be an effective treatment for COVID-19. President Trump appears to be promoting an unproven cocktail of drugs administered by Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, a self-described simple country doctor in New York who's been widely promoted on Fox News. Meanwhile, White House aides are discussing plans to reopen the U.S. economy as early as May 1st. Despite warnings from public health officials that an end to social distancing measures could lead to a new surge of infections and deaths. The head of the World Health Organization said Wednesday he's received death threats and racist insults while leading the international fight against the coronavirus pandemic. Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus was responding to a reporter's question about whether criticism from world leaders like President Trump made his job more difficult.
Please don't politicize this virus. It exploits the differences you have at the national level. If you want to be exploited, and if you want to have many more body bags, then you do it.
This week, President Trump tried to shift blame for his administration's disastrous response to the pandemic onto the World Health Organization, calling the agency too China-centric. Trump and senior Republicans, including Senator Lindsey Graham and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have said they may withhold U.S. funding for the World Health Organization. Medical researchers say the novel coronavirus likely circulated undetected for weeks in New York beginning in February, long before New York confirmed its first COVID-19 case March 1st. Two separate teams of researchers say genetic material taken from thousands of patients shows the main source of early infections came from Europe and not from Asia. The finding undermines President Trump's argument that his ban on travelers from China in late January delayed the arrival of the coronavirus in the U.S. It also underscores how a critical lack of testing laid the seeds for an explosion of COVID-19 illnesses and deaths in New York and beyond. Meanwhile, the National Academy of Sciences warns the spread of the coronavirus is unlikely to slow as springtime temperatures return to the Northern Hemisphere. Senator Bernie Sanders said Wednesday he's suspending his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, making former Vice President Joe Biden the presumptive nominee to face Donald Trump in the November election. Sanders addressed his supporters in a live stream from his home in Burlington, Vermont.
Together, we have transformed American consciousness as to what kind of nation we can become, and have taken this country a major step forward in the never-ending struggle for economic justice, social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice.
After headlines, we'll play extended remarks from Senator Sanders' concession speech and talk to journalist and activist Naomi Klein about his historic presidential campaign. In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition fighting Houthi rebels has declared a 2-week unilateral ceasefire as COVID-19 spreads across the Arabian Peninsula. 5 years of war have devastated Yemen's healthcare and sanitation infrastructure, leading to what the United Nations calls the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. Over 10,000 people, over 100,000 people are dead, with millions at risk of famine, as well as COVID-19 infection. Yemen has recorded over 2 million cases of cholera since 2016. Last month, the Trump administration cut off tens of millions of dollars in medical aid and other assistance for Yemen. The Yemen ceasefire comes amidst reports that as many as 150 members of the Saudi royal family have contracted COVID-19, including 76-year-old Prince Faisal bin Bandar, the governor of Riyadh, who's reportedly been admitted to an intensive care unit. Human rights groups are calling on Israel to urgently lift its blockade of occupied Gaza and the West Bank to allow the flow of medical supplies, equipment, and medical personnel needed to stem the spread of the coronavirus and to treat COVID-19 patients. This comes as Palestinian health officials say Gaza has run out of coronavirus test kits and are pleading with international organizations for more ventilators and beds for intensive care units. Meanwhile, the Pentagon has gifted 1 million surgical masks to the Israel Defense Forces as soldiers remain on patrol in occupied Palestinian territories during the outbreak. The Israeli government has ordered Palestinians who hold permits to work in Israel to download a smartphone app giving Israel's military access to personal and GPS location data and even to cameras. In immigration news, Italy has closed its ports to boats that provide humanitarian aid to migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean. Government officials say its ports are no longer safe amidst the coronavirus outbreak. In Greece, fears are mounting over the uncontrollable spread of the coronavirus in overcrowded and unsanitary refugee camps. The Greek government says it won't be reviewing new asylum cases until after the crisis is over, leaving thousands of people trapped in camps. In Bolivia, hundreds of people are stranded in a military quarantine camp after they tried to cross the Chilean border back into Bolivia to avoid Chile's 14-day mandatory quarantine. The camp was built last week to hold Bolivians who were not in the country when the coronavirus outbreak began. In Colorado, 13-year-old Charlotte Figge has died of respiratory failure and cardiac arrest stemming from a suspected case of COVID-19. As a small child, Charlotte suffered from relentless epileptic seizures that improved dramatically after her family treated her with oil from a strain of medical marijuana high in the chemical CBD. That's since been named Charlotte's Web. The oil is now widely used to treat certain forms of epilepsy. To read more about Charlotte's case, go to democracynow.org. In environmental news, the snow-capped Himalayas are visible from cities in northern India for the first time in 30 years, as pollution levels have dropped dramatically since the enactment of the nationwide coronavirus lockdown. Los Angeles saw some of the cleanest air of any city in the world this week, as the dark smog and pollution that usually clouds the city's skyline have dissipated under California's strict stay-at-home measures. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is set to open more than 100 national wildlife refuges to hunting and fishing. The plan would allow fishing for the first time at several wildlife refuges, including the San Diego Bay and the Everglades headwaters in Florida. And the American Civil Liberties Union is demanding an investigation into the Border Patrol's abuse of pregnant migrants in their custody. The complaint filed Wednesday details how a Guatemalan woman gave birth at the Chula Vista Border Patrol station near San Diego, standing up, holding onto a trash can while still wearing her pants. She had pleaded with Border Patrol agents for help, but they reportedly told her to sit down and wait to be processed. She'd been detained with her husband and 2 young daughters in February as they hoped to apply for asylum in the U.S. In related news, the Trump administration has quietly shut down the country's asylum system for the first time in decades, using an obscure public health law to justify one of the most aggressive U.S.-Mexico border crackdowns amidst the pandemic. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with Senator Bernie Sanders' announcement Wednesday that he's suspending his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. Vice President Joe Biden is now the presumptive nominee to face Republican President Donald Trump in the November election. Sanders addressed his supporters in a live stream from his home in Burlington, Vermont.
Together, we have transformed American consciousness as to what kind of nation we can become, and have taken this country a major step forward in the never-ending struggle for economic justice, social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. As many of you will recall, Nelson Mandela, one of the great freedom fighters in modern world history, famously said, and I quote, "It always seems impossible until it is done," end quote. And what he meant by that is that the greatest obstacle to real social change has everything to do with the power of the corporate and political establishment to limit our vision as to what is possible and what we are entitled to as human beings. If we don't believe that we are entitled to health care as a human right, we will never achieve universal health care. If we don't believe that we are entitled to decent wages and working conditions, millions of us will continue to live in poverty. If we don't believe that we are entitled to all of the education we require to fulfill our dreams, many of us will leave school saddled with huge debt or never get the education we need. If we don't believe that we are entitled to live in a world that has a clean environment and is not ravaged by climate change, we will continue to see more drought, floods, rising sea levels, and increasingly uninhabitable planet. If we don't believe that we are entitled to live in a world of justice, democracy, and fairness without racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, or religious bigotry, we will continue to have massive income and wealth inequality, prejudice and hatred, mass incarceration, terrified immigrants, and hundreds of thousands of Americans sleeping out on the streets in the richest country on earth. And focusing on that new vision for America is what our campaign has been about and what, in fact, we have accomplished. Few would deny that over the course of the past 5 years, our movement has won the ideological struggle. In so-called red states and blue states and purple states, a majority of the American people now understand that we must raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour, that we must guarantee health care as a right to all of our people, that we must transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, and that higher education must be available to all, regardless of income. It was not long ago that people considered these ideas radical and fringe. Today, they are mainstream ideas, and many of them are already being implemented in cities and states across the country. That is what we have accomplished together. In terms of health care, even before this horrific pandemic we are now experiencing, more and more Americans understood that we must move to a Medicare for All single-payer program. During the primary elections, exit polls showed in state after state a strong majority of Democratic primary voters supported a single government health insurance program to replace private insurance. That was true even in states where our campaign did not prevail. And let me just say this. In terms of health care, this current horrific crisis that we are now in has exposed for all to see how absurd our current employer-based health insurance system is. The current economic downturn we are experiencing has not only led to a massive loss of jobs, but has also resulted in millions of Americans losing their health insurance. While Americans have been told over and over again how wonderful our employer-based private insurance system is, those claims sound very hollow today as a growing number of unemployed workers struggle with how they can afford to go to the doctor or not go bankrupt with a huge hospital bill. We have always believed that health care must be considered as a human right, not an employee benefit, and we are right. Please also appreciate that not only are we winning the struggle ideologically, we are also winning it generationally. The future of our country rests with young people. And in state after state, whether we won or whether we lost, the Democratic primaries or caucuses, we received a significant majority of the votes, sometimes an overwhelming majority, from people not only 30 years of age or under, but 50 years of age or younger. In other words, the future of this country is with our ideas. As we are all painfully aware, we now face an unprecedented crisis. Not only are we dealing with a coronavirus pandemic, which is taking the lives of many thousands of our people, we are also dealing with an economic meltdown that has resulted in the loss of millions of jobs. Today, families all across our country face financial hardship unimaginable only a few months ago. And because of the unacceptable levels of income and wealth inequality in our economy, many of our friends and neighbors have little or no savings and are desperately trying to pay their rent or their mortgage or even put food on the table. This reality makes it clear to me that Congress must address this unprecedented crisis in an unprecedented way that protects the health and economic well-being of the working families of our country, not just powerful special interests. As a member of the Democratic leadership in the United States Senate, and as a senator from the state of Vermont, this is something that I intend to intensely be involved in over the next number of months, and that will require an enormous amount of work. Which takes me to the state of our presidential campaign. I wish I could give you better news, but I think you know the truth. And that is that we are now some 300 delegates behind Vice President Biden, and the path toward victory is virtually impossible. So while we are winning the ideological battle, and while we are winning the support of so many young people and working people throughout the country, I have concluded that this battle for the Democratic nomination will not be successful. And so today, I am announcing the suspension of my campaign. While this campaign is coming to an end, our movement is not. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that, quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice," end quote. The fight for justice is what our campaign has been about. The fight for justice is what our movement remains about. Today, I congratulate Joe Biden, a very decent man, who I will work with to move our progressive ideas forward. On a practical note, let me also say this. I will stay on the ballot in all remaining states and continue to gather delegates. While Vice President Biden will be the nominee, we must continue working to assemble as many delegates as possible at the Democratic Convention, where we will be able to exert significant influence over the party platform and other functions. Then together, standing united, we will go forward to defeat Donald Trump, the most dangerous president in modern American history. And we will fight to elect strong progressives at every level of government, from Congress to the school board. As I hope all of you know, this race has never been about me. I ran for the presidency because I believe that as a president, I could accelerate and institutionalize the progressive changes that we are all building together. And if we keep organizing and fighting, I have no doubt but that is exactly what will happen. While the path may be slower now, we will change this nation, and with like-minded friends around the globe, change the entire world.
Senator Bernie Sanders announcing Wednesday he's suspending his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, speaking from his home in Burlington, Vermont. When we come back, we'll speak with journalist and activist Naomi Klein, a well-known Sanders supporter, about Sanders' historic presidential campaign, and we'll talk to her about coronavirus capitalism, President Trump's response to the pandemic. Stay with us.
You're wondering just what I'll do now that it's over and done. Well, that's something to think about, and I've already begun. I suppose that I'll find a way. People usually do, but it's something to think about. I'll be lost without you. One thing I would have you do, please consider the dawn. The dawn of your lonely years, when youth and beauty are gone, and when you can no longer have.
Something to Think About by Willie Nelson, who will be joining Neil Young and John Mellencamp and others April 11th for a big Farm Aid concert to support first frontline essential workers, from grocery store clerks to delivery truck drivers to healthcare workers. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman, broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, New York City, along with my co-host, who's right here in New York City as well. Unfortunately, not next to me where we usually are in the studio, but preventing community spread by broadcasting from home. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, we're going to turn right now to Bernie Sanders. We just played his speech as he withdrew his bid for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. Joe Biden now faces the challenge of winning over his supporters. On Wednesday, 7 progressive groups made up of young activists, including Next Gen America, Sunrise Movement, and Justice Democrats, issued the Biden campaign a series of platform demands, saying, quote, the organizations will spend more than $100 million, but we need help ensuring our efforts will be backed up by a campaign that speaks to our generation, they said. We're joined now by Naomi Klein, senior correspondent at The Intercept. She endorsed Bernie Sanders back in November and is joining us to talk not only about his historic campaign as it surged and now as it's suspended, but also to talk about coronavirus capitalism. Naomi is the inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair of Media Culture and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University, author of a number of books, including The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, her latest book on fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal. Naomi, it's great to have you with us. You were one of our last guests in studio here, and now you're speaking to us from your home in New Jersey. Can you talk about how you and your family have fared during this pandemic?
Well, it's very good to be sort of with you, Amy, and it is true that going on your show is the last thing I did in person before this kind of lockdown. And thank you for asking. We are all doing well and healthy at the moment, and though we weren't a couple of weeks ago, and so we're very relieved to be. And I just want to express my gratitude to you and the whole Democracy Now! Team continuing to broadcast and bring us so many just crucial voices in this period.
Naomi, you and your family were exposed to COVID-19, is that right?
Yeah, we believe that we were because a colleague and friend of ours stayed at our house and we spent time together. Actually, the night before I saw you, Amy, which is why you know about this, because we contacted everyone we came in contact with, and that friend went back to Canada, got sick, and because they live somewhere where there's more testing, was able to get tested and did test positive. And so when we started showing symptoms, my husband Abby Lewis and I, we wondered about that, but we're fine, and you appear to be fine too, Amy. So we are the least of people's worries right now. We're all good, and our colleague has recovered and is doing well as well.
And of course, that's an absolutely critical issue. The severe lack of testing to this day, whatever the president asserts, in New York City, the epicenter, and all over the country. But Naomi, before we talk about that, Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign. You, until recently, were saying he should continue, especially during this pandemic, to run for president. So can you talk about your response to his address and his decision?
Well, I think the main thing that I want to say this morning, Amy, is I just would like to express my huge gratitude to Bernie Sanders, to his entire family, to the many people who worked for the campaign just so tirelessly and opened up the window of what was possible politically in this country. It was an incredibly tough campaign. And I trust that Bernie is making the right decision in this moment as the leader of that campaign and also as a U.S. Senator. I know that he's not going to just go relax. As he said in his address, he intends to fight for people, as he has always done in this critical moment, in terms of what kind of relief, rescue, and reimagining that we do in the midst of this pandemic. He is staying on the ballot. He is still building power in order to pressure the Democratic Party and Joe Biden to run the most progressive campaign that they can. So I feel so much gratitude for Senator Sanders. More than anything else, I think what the campaign did is help us find each other. And by us, I mean that huge us of the Not Me, Us campaign. And he did this not just in this campaign, but in 2016, where he really broke the spell of the Reagan era. That spell that has lasted for 4 decades, that told people who believed that this system that was funneling so much wealth upwards and spreading insecurity, precariousness, poverty, and pollution for everybody else. Everybody who saw that system and thought there was something deeply wrong with it, what the neoliberal era told us was that we were the ones who were crazy. We were a tiny minority of fringe people, and that we should just accept it. And what the Sanders campaign did in 2016 is tell us that we had been lied to, that in fact there were so many millions of us who saw that this world was fundamentally upside down. And all of the incredible organizing, including digital organizing, but also in-person organizing, wove this amazing web. And we were able to find each other and find that we were many and they were few. And so, I don't think we can ever thank Bernie Sanders and the campaign enough for that. And being part of the campaign as a volunteer, but I did go to 4 states for the campaign, provided some of the greatest moments of my political life. I mean, I was in Nevada when we won. And got to be part of that incredibly joyful moment, and just got to meet so many other like-minded people. And I think in Senator Sanders' address that we just heard, Amy, I think he was so correct in zeroing in on the conspiracy of lowered expectations. Right? He focused. He very directly addressed the American public and said, if you don't believe that you deserve universal health care, you're not going to get it. If you don't believe that you deserve a safe planet, you're not going to get it. And I think that is really at the heart of why he lost. We've heard again and again, Bernie has won the battle of ideas. But the truth is there is a difference between winning a battle of ideas, winning an intellectual battle about what kind of policies are right and just and will keep us safe, and believing that you can win. You can simultaneously win that battle of ideas and still believe that you will never actually win, that you are still a weak minority, that you will still be destroyed by the forces of establishment power and money. And that, I think, is the real generational divide that Bernie was also speaking to in that address. I don't think that Bernie lost because of a battle between leftists and centrists, although, of course, that battle is still raging. But we had a progressive majority on the issues. But where the generational divide comes in, and Bernie spoke to this, is that among voters, not just under 30, but in many cases under 45, under 50, were starting to believe that they could actually win. And I think particularly among that majority of young voters that always backed Bernie, they understood that the intellectual project of neoliberalism was bankrupt, that it had lost its powers of persuasion, and that these words like democratic socialists were not as scary anymore. In fact, they had become appealing. But I think for that older generation that has, particularly the older generation that has a living memory of the state violence of the 1960s that waged literal war on revolutionary movement leaders, that sent them into exile, that sent them into their graves, that surveilled them, blacklisted them. When Bernie's opponents raised the specter of the Red Scare that would be used against him, that was incredibly triggering, terrifying, and they couldn't. Progressive voters who agreed with Bernie could not believe that he could win. Where younger voters did believe that he could win. And that was, I think, the most important generational divide.
Naomi, a lot of people believed, progressives, but also others, that since this coronavirus emergency has exposed so many failures of the U.S. system, healthcare, as well as the absence of a social safety net, that this would enhance support for Sanders and his policies. Your response to that, and also whether you think his supporters will actually back Biden. I mean, Sanders did not say yesterday, he did not explicitly endorse Biden.
Well, I think that he implied that that after the battles over the platform were won, then it would all be about coming together and defeating Trump. So I don't know. That's not the way I heard it. I think that there's no doubt that the way this pandemic is playing out is it's further opening up that window of what is politically possible, indeed what is necessary for people's survival. And so, yes, support for Medicare for all is surging, as well as support for other kinds of programs like housing for all that were always at the center of the Sanders campaign. In your headlines just now, we heard news about the air clearing around the world. We are seeing that it is possible to clean the air. A lot of people like that as one of these silver linings of this crisis. But this isn't how we want to clean the air. We don't want to clean the air by crash, by brutal crash. We want to clean the air by craft. We want to design policies that care for workers, that protect workers, that retrain workers, but allow us to live in a way that doesn't poison people's lungs, which, by the way, is part of what is making Black and brown communities more vulnerable to the coronavirus, because those are the communities that have the most polluting industries in their backyards. That's one of the factors. So people are seeing this and being radicalized by this and demanding policies that were at the center of the Sanders campaign. But during times of crisis, people also are risk averse. And so, I think the timing of this was such, and with the inability to continue campaigning in person, with people just reaching for something that looked and felt safe, I don't think it was possible to translate that shift in openness to these kinds of policies with a huge electoral swing from Biden towards Bernie, although I was certainly hoping for it up until Bernie's announcement last night. But while hoping for it, I was keenly aware that the polls were not reflecting it, that it wasn't happening, and that people are not up for that kind of political seesaw in this moment of tumult. So what we have to be focused on, what the movement that the Sanders campaign represents, but also all of the social movements that were part of that campaign, independent social movements, and also movements that never joined the campaign. What we need to be focused on right now is winning those policies for a kind of a people's bailout in this moment of profound crisis. And we need to be focused on beating Donald Trump in November. Absolutely.
And how exactly do you see that happening? This is our last question to you. We're going to then play a clip of Noam Chomsky talking about the significance of Bernie Sanders. But I wanted to ask you, Naomi, how you see this happening when people have to be isolated. It's not clear what's going to happen in the coming months. Clearly, in the White House right now, they're talking about opening as fast as possible the country, despite the dire warnings of scientists that another surge could happen if Trump does this. He's removed the Inspector General in charge of the $500 billion corporate fund that corporations will be bailed out by, despite the fact that Democrats put that into the bill to ensure that there would be some kind of oversight, but clearly didn't put it in strongly enough because he's able to just fire the person. We're going to talk in a moment about the disparities of who is affected by this. Is certainly not a great leveler, the coronavirus. Those on the front lines are, of course, the most hard hit, and who are on the front lines of inequality in the country are the most hard hit. But your whole assessment of coronavirus capitalism right now, where it stands right now on what has to happen in these next months?
So I think our phones still work, our internet still works, so we are still able to make ourselves heard in sending a very clear message to people in Congress who are going to have to be running for re-election, that people are enraged by this bailout. And the fact that these meager strings that were attached to the corporate bailout were immediately snipped by the Trump administration in terms of oversight, in terms of congressional oversight, in terms of their own watchdogs, in terms of giving Steve Mnuchin the ability to override that oversight. I think that the battle, frankly, when it comes to a disaster capitalism and this sort of corporate free-for-all that we're seeing right now under cover of pandemic, that battle was lost when the rescue for people was bundled together with the corporate bailout. I think what the demand that we need to make on lawmakers right now is that they need to keep those things separate so that they aren't held hostage, right? When we look at the fact that there was that people voted for that bailout who shouldn't have voted for it, it was because they couldn't be seen, or they felt that they couldn't be seen to be voting for what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called crumbs for our families, right? Because those crumbs are not nothing when people are starving. So the battle, really, the political battle was lost when those two things were bundled together, when the people's rescue was bundled together with the corporate rescue. So people need to send that message very, very strongly. The fact is, there is power right now, and there is power from the working people who are holding the world together, this country together, but the world together, the healthcare workers, the janitors, the caretakers, the delivery workers, the people who are picking our food under very unsafe conditions. And we are seeing a wave of job action from these workers who understand themselves to be so essential, despite decades of having their labor belittled by those in power. And that is, that was one of the great strengths of the Sanders campaign, was that he always recognized the power of those essential workers. It's why he was supported overwhelmingly by Amazon workers, by grocery store workers, and of course by nurses and by teachers. And so this is a time for us to be organizing and taking leadership from those workers. And I have to say that one of my great regrets from having been involved in this campaign is watching my friends in the progressive movement who didn't support Sanders, in part because they weren't able to take leadership from those working people who recognized Sanders as their champion from the very beginning. And they felt that those workers didn't understand their own best interests, and so they wanted them to support somebody else. And this is a moment where if we say that we have so much gratitude for these frontline workers, let's trust them politically too, and let's do everything we can to augment their political power. Let's demand that of our trade unions. Let's demand that of ourselves. Let's support them tangibly, but let's also take leadership from them, which is something that Bernie Sanders always did. And it is one of the things that I love most about him.
Naomi Klein, I want to thank you for being with us, senior correspondent at The Intercept, professor at Rutgers University. Tonight, she's joining in an After Bernie online teach-in with Esther Taylor and Kianga Yamata-Taylor. We'll link to it at our website. Before we go to break on Wednesday, just before Bernie Sanders announced, but it did look like he was about to pull out of the presidential race, I asked political dissident linguist and author Noam Chomsky about his assessment of the Bernie Sanders campaign in this time of the coronavirus pandemic.
If Trump is reelected, it's an indescribable disaster. It means that the policies of the past 4 years, which have been extremely destructive to the American population, to the world, will be continued and probably accelerated. What this is going to mean for health is bad enough. I just mentioned the Lancet figures. It'll get worse. What this means for the environment, or the threat of nuclear war, which no one is talking about, but is extremely serious, is indescribable. Suppose Biden is elected. I would anticipate it would be essentially a continuation of Obama. Nothing very great, but at least not totally destructive. And opportunities for an organized public to change what is being done, to impose pressures. It's common to say now that the Sanders' campaign failed. I think that's a mistake. I think it was an extraordinary success, completely shifted the arena of debate and discussion. Issues that were unthinkable a couple of years ago are now right in the middle of attention. The worst crime he committed in the eyes of the establishment is not the policies proposing. It's the fact that he was able to inspire popular movements which had already been developing, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, many others, and turn them into an activist movement which doesn't just show up every couple of years to push a lever and then go home, but applies constant pressure, constant activism, and so on. That could affect a Biden administration.
That's activist, public intellectual, world-renowned linguist Noam Chomsky. We'll spend the hour with him on Friday on Democracy Now! This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the racial disparities. Who's dying in this pandemic? Stay with us.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
It's the right thing to do.
It's up to you.
It's the right thing to do.
It's Up to You by Steinsky with the words of Mario Savio. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic in New York City. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn to the devastating toll the coronavirus is taking on Black Americans who are disproportionately dying from the virus across the country. In Michigan and Illinois, African Americans make up, 14 to 15% of the population, but account for 41% of the COVID-19 deaths. In Chicago alone, African Americans account for 70% of the city's deaths, yet just 30% of the population. In Louisiana, one of the hot spots of the virus, African Americans comprise about a third of the population, but 70% of the COVID-19 deaths. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who once called the virus the great equalizer, said Wednesday Black people make up 18% of the deaths in the state, despite being 9% of the state population. The Latinx community makes up 29% of New York City, but 34% of the deaths, many of them in Queens, the most diverse community in the nation. The actual number of deaths due to COVID-19 will likely be never known, as people, often undocumented, those on the margins of society, are dying at home uncounted. For more, we turn to Kamara Phyllis-Jones. She's a family physician, epidemiologist, past president of the American Public Health Association. Her recent piece for Newsweek magazine, titled "Coronavirus Disease Discriminates, Our Healthcare Doesn't Have to." Why don't you elaborate on that, Dr. Jones? This issue and why you see this disparate effect on the African-American population.
COVID-19 is exposing U.S. racism in a stark new way because the black and brown bodies are piling up so fast that these deaths can't be normalized or ignored. And the way that racism is operating in this pandemic is in two separate fronts. It's increasing exposure to the virus, and it has increased vulnerability to the virus. So increasing exposure to the virus because the way that racism that structures opportunity and assigns value has structured our educational opportunities and job opportunities. We are in more front-facing, low-income, underappreciated jobs where we are part of the essential workforce that really isn't getting its full attention and certainly not getting the full protection that we need. racism has increased the vulnerability of us to this virus because living in racially segregated communities that are resource segregated without adequate access to food and our environmental racism hazard segregated has made us carry in our bodies all of those same diseases, diabetes, high blood pressure, renal disease, asthma, that are making people who get infected to the virus sicker and die faster from it.
And Dr. Jones, even before, I mean, we mentioned the statistics everywhere, but in Chicago, even before the pandemic began, the life expectancy of African Americans was 9 years, slightly less than 9 years less than white people who live in Chicago. So could you say, Dr. Jones, what you feel should be done? What steps should be taken to compensate for the disproportionate vulnerability of African Americans, Latinx communities in light of this health emergency?
Right. I am so glad that you asked me that question, because we can't just look at these statistics and then shrug or say, oh, well, we expected that. We have to act. And so the way that we act is on both fronts. You asked me, how do we act when we recognize that we have chronically been sicker and dying sooner? What that means is if we already recognize that, we have to move all of the health resources to those areas where we can already expect higher deaths and all. So we should not have Black people already burdened with these diseases living in communities where they can't get adequate testing, number one, but adequate access to ventilators and health resources in the not. So we need to provide resources according to need, and we can already predict that need. On that vulnerability side, the other thing that I really need to say is you will be seeing now in the news lots of different ways of people trying to say, if we have to ration ventilators, well, maybe we should discount people if they have diabetes or whatever. We cannot allow that to happen. First of all, we should not be working under a scenario of scarcity, because there's no reason we have to have scarcity. So we should reject that. But certainly if we do have one ventilator and 3 patients, there should never be any counting in of this person has diabetes or heart disease in that allocation. I actually think that if it comes down to that, we need to have a random allocation of those resources. We need to value all individuals and populations equally. That's one of 3 core principles for achieving health equity.
Kamara Phyllis-Jones, let me ask you one last question, and then we're going to do part 2 and post it at democracynow.org. This critical lack of testing that has completely compromised the public health response in this country. You have talked about the fact that that discriminates against African Americans as well, where people can even get tests.
Yes, that's true, where people can get tests. But I have to say the kind of haphazard way that we've approached testing is affecting all of us. It's affecting our ability to alter the course of the epidemic. The way that we're using testing in this country right now is to confirm diagnosis in a very narrow, one person by one person kind of clinical, in the medical space way.
We just have 20 seconds.
So what we really need to do is we need to find out everybody who has the disease. So we need to do a public health testing, test those with symptoms, test those, to sample those who don't have symptoms so that we can distribute our resources, so that we can identify and isolate people who have the disease before they're symptomatic, while they're spreading it, and also do contact tracing. That will be for the good of all of us. That way we don't document the epidemic, we actually can change the course of it.
Kamara Phyllis-Jones, I want to thank you for being with us. We're going to do part 2, posted at democracynow.org. Family physician, epidemiologist, past president of the American Public Health Association, currently Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University fellow. That does it for our show. Thank you to all the team that has made this show possible. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.